I sat quietly on the wooden bench inside the county courthouse, reading over some case notes. The building buzzed with chatter, heels clicking against the marble, papers shuffling behind counters. I had chosen to dress low-key, no badge, no suit, just a charcoal gray polo, jeans, and a black windbreaker. My presence wasn't supposed to draw attention today. But it did. A deputy walking by slowed his step and gave me a sideways glance. Then another officer nudged him and smirked. I caught them whispering to each other, chuckling under their breath. One even pointed at my worn sneakers. "Lost, sir?" one finally asked, crossing his arms with a cocky grin. "You looking for traffic court or just killing time?" I glanced up. "Just waiting." The other added, chuckling. "Bet you are." I didn't reply. I had seen this too many times. I wasn't here for them. I was here to quietly observe a trial involving a federal informant and potential internal leaks. But they didn't know that. They kept laughing. I looked back down at my notes and waited for the moment that always comes, the moment they realize they should have asked my name first. When the bailiff opened the heavy doors to courtroom 2B, I stood and walked in calmly. The same two officers who'd been chuckling earlier followed behind me, still grinning, as if expecting me to sit in the back row and watch like a lost tourist. Instead, I walked straight to the first row reserved for federal observers. Hey, hold on," one of them barked, stepping in front of me. "This section's not open to the public." "It's fine," I said evenly. "I'm with the case." "With the case?" he repeated with a sarcastic snort. "Sure you are. Got a badge to prove that, or are we just pretending today?" The second officer moved closer. "Look, man, don't make this harder than it has to be. You want to watch the show, take a seat in the back. Don't start acting like you run the place." I remained calm, but my patience was wearing thin. "I'm not acting," I said. "Just trying to do my job." A third deputy, an older one, stepped up, drawn by the tension. "What's the issue?" The first officer responded quickly, "This guy's trying to sit in the reserved section, says he's with the case. But he doesn't have anything to prove it." The older deputy looked at me more carefully. I saw something flicker behind his eyes, uncertainty. Recognition, maybe. I gave him a small nod. "Agent Darnell Harper. I'm here under direct orders from Director Langley's office. You might want to check again who's pretending." Silence. The laughter died instantly. The older deputy's face stiffened. He didn't say anything right away, just gave me a long, searching look. Then he pulled out his radio and stepped aside, speaking quietly into it as the two younger officers stood frozen in place, their confidence leaking fast. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides. The younger one who had mocked me earlier cleared his throat. "You said Harper." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. A court clerk came out from the side hallway, holding a small folder and scanning the room. Her eyes landed on me and widened slightly. She walked straight over, bypassing the officers entirely. "Director Harper," she said briskly. "We weren't sure what time you'd arrive. The judge has been briefed. You're welcome to sit wherever you'd like, your materials are already in chambers." The room shifted. One of the younger deputies blinked. "Director?" I turned to him slowly. "Yeah. Director. As in FBI." The silence between us was suffocating. The older deputy returned, eyes on the ground, and gave the two younger officers a look that could carve stone. "Let him through. Now." They didn't argue. I stepped past them, not bothering with another word. The courtroom doors loomed ahead. Time to get to work. As I walked into the courtroom, the energy shifted. The judge, a seasoned woman with a sharp gaze and decades on the bench, gave me a subtle nod from the bench. She already knew who I was. Most people in this room didn't, until now. Behind me, I heard the quiet shuffle of the two officers awkwardly retreating toward the back wall, trying to make themselves invisible. Their mocking tone from earlier had evaporated completely. The courtroom was packed, attorneys, press, and federal observers. This case had attracted attention, but not for the reasons they thought. There was more beneath the surface than anyone realized: leaks, missing evidence, compromised witnesses. And that's exactly why I was here. I took my place at the federal bench, opened my folder, and began reviewing the classified notes I'd brought with me. The prosecutor leaned over slightly, startled when she caught a glance of my credentials. "You're Harper," she whispered. I nodded without looking up. She leaned back like she'd just realized she was sitting next to a loaded weapon. A minute later, the judge gavelled the room to order. "This session is now in progress," she said. "We are joined today by Director Darnell Harper of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who will be observing under directive from Washington." Heads turned. A visible wave of discomfort rippled across the courtroom, especially toward the back, where the two officers stood like statues. You could feel it, how quickly the courtroom atmosphere changed once my title was spoken aloud. No one laughed now. No one even whispered. The same officers who had smirked at me an hour ago were now standing stiff, eyes locked on the floor, likely replaying every word they'd said. The one who called me "man" with a smirk earlier now looked like he wanted to disappear into his uniform. The judge continued her remarks, laying out the schedule for the day, but the energy in the room had clearly been rerouted. People sat straighter. Spoke softer. Watched every move. When the first witness was called, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, scanning through the document ID brought. The lead defense attorney turned around and gave me a polite nod, clearly realizing who I was only now. I nodded back. After 10 minutes of testimony, there was a pause. The judge looked toward me. "Director Harper," she said, "would you like to address the court before we proceed?" I stood, calm and composed, and adjusted the microphone in front of me. "With permission, Your Honor," I said evenly, "I'll reserve my comments until the end of testimony. But I'll be here the entire time." I sat back down. Behind me, one of the deputies let out the quietest sigh. I could practically hear the regret in his breath. But that was the thing about respect: you couldn't fake it, and you couldn't patch it up after the damage was done. The trial pressed forward, but the tension never left the air. Every glance, every shuffle of paper, was heavy now. The younger officer who'd mocked me earlier tried to blend into the background, but his nerves betrayed him, shifting from foot to foot, arms crossed too tightly. He wasn't used to being watched this closely, especially not by someone who could have his badge suspended with a single phone call. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to confront him. The silence between us was louder than anything I could have said. During a recess, I stepped out into the hallway. Almost immediately, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. "Sir, Director Harper," the officer said, his voice low. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. His face had dropped its arrogance. Now it was pale and tense. I didn't know who you were." "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said quickly. "I thought you were just," I cut him off with a glance. "That was the problem," I said quietly. "You assumed." He swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." I stepped closer. "Don't treat people based on what you think they are. Treat them based on what you don't know. That's how you avoid these conversations." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't just embarrassed, he was changed. Not by rank. Not by fear. But by the quiet truth of his mistake. By the time closing arguments began, the entire courtroom had settled into a different rhythm. Respect wasn't just given, it was enforced by presence alone. The defense tried to pivot, to cloud the narrative. But the facts were intact. And I was here to ensure they stayed that way. No tampering. No backdoor deals. No overlooked files. I'd seen too much of that in other states. Not today. When the judge asked if I had anything further to offer the court, I stood once more. This case isn't just about evidence, I said calmly. It's about accountability. And today's testimony will be reviewed thoroughly at the federal level. Every word. Every officer. Every action. I looked directly at the officers near the rear wall, especially the ones who had laughed. We don't correct systems with anger. We correct them with memory. And I won't forget how this day started. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. No one dared move. I nodded to the judge and returned to my seat. As court adjourned, and people slowly filed out, not a single person blocked my path. No sideways comments. No smug looks. Just silence, and the weight of realization settling into the room like dust after a storm. And as I walked out of that courthouse, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Because the message had landed, without a single badge ever needing to be shown. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright, but the mood was subdued. A few reporters lingered near the steps, hoping for a quote or a glance. I didn't give them either. My presence wasn't for headlines. As I walked toward the black SUV waiting at the curb, I noticed the older deputy, the one who had sensed something was off earlier, standing near the door. He gave me a slow nod. "Apologies, Director," he said quietly. "Should have intervened sooner." I returned the nod. "You read the room better than most. That matters." He opened the door for me. As I climbed in, my phone buzzed. A message from the bureau, "Full internal review approved. Proceeding with discipline recommendation." Good call staying on this one. I exhaled. This wasn't the first courtroom I'd walked into anonymously. And it wouldn't be the last. Because sometimes, the best way to reveal truth wasn't through a speech, or a press conference. It was through letting people show who they really are, before they realize who you are. And that's when change begins. Back at the field office later that evening, I sat across from two internal affairs agents in the quiet operations room. The hum of fluorescent lights and the soft clicks of their pens were the only sounds. I had handed over my report, names, times, behavior. Nothing emotional. Just the facts. That's all it ever took. One of them, Agent Lin, leaned back in his chair. "So let me get this straight. They mocked you, in open court?" I nodded once. He shook his head. "And they still had no clue?" "None," I replied. "Not until it was too late." The second agent, Morales, tapped his pen against his notebook. "You want us to move forward with formal disciplinary recommendations?" I paused, thinking. "They don't need to be destroyed," I said. "They need to be trained. Corrected. Watched. But the ones who stood silent while it happened? Start there." They both nodded. Morales scribbled something. "Understood. You handled it without escalation. That goes a long way upstairs." "That's why I did it this way," I said. "Not everything has to end with a headline. Sometimes, the lesson sticks better when it's quiet." As I stood to leave, Agent Lin looked up. "For what it's worth, sir, most people in your position would have exploded." I looked at him and gave a small, tired smile. "That's the luxury of knowing who you are," I said. "You don't have to raise your voice when you already outrank the room." A week later, the courthouse looked the same, but the people inside didn't. Mandatory sensitivity training had been quietly rolled out for court officers across the district. Internal audits were now scheduled quarterly instead of annually. The two deputies who mocked me had been temporarily reassigned, no suspension, but under direct supervision. Their conduct was under review. But more importantly, something had shifted in the culture. I knew it when I walked back into that same courthouse for a separate matter. Same bench. Same courtroom. different tone. This time, when I entered, no one stopped me. The court clerk greeted me by name. The judge rose when I approached the bench. And the officers on duty, some familiar, some new, stood a little straighter, spoke with more caution. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. They now knew what they hadn't before, that authority doesn't always wear a uniform or demand attention. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back of the room, watching. I didn't need to remind anyone who I was. They remembered. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone like me walks through those doors, without a badge showing or a title announced, they won't be mocked. They'll be respected. Because the lesson had landed. Months passed. I never brought up that courtroom incident again, not in speeches, not in interviews, not even within the bureau. It didn't need to become a headline. The ones who needed to remember already did. But the impact lingered. I received a letter in my office mailbox, handwritten, no return address. The handwriting was careful, the tone uncertain. Director Harper, you probably don't remember me by name, but I was one of the deputies in that courtroom. The younger one. The one who spoke first. I want to say I'm sorry, not just for what I said, but for what I assumed. Since then, I've gone through the training. But that's not what changed me. What changed me was how you handled it. Quiet. Precise. Professional. No show. No punishment parade. That stuck with me more than any policy ever could. I'm working to be better now. Thank you for not embarrassing me when you had every right to. I folded the note and placed it in a locked drawer in my desk, with a handful of others like it, moments when silence made the loudest statement. People often think authority is about commands and power. But true leadership? It's how you hold the room when everyone else thinks you don't belong in it, until they learn you built it. 6 months later, I found myself in another courthouse, different state, different faces, same mission. I was there to observe a federal witness hearing tied to a corruption case with national implications. As I walked through security, one of the guards glanced up and said, "Morning, Director Harper." I paused. He was young, sharp-eyed, respectful. I hadn't met him before. "You know me?" I asked. "Yes, sir," he replied. We were briefed. "Also, some of the guys back east told us about how you handle things." I gave a slight nod, hiding the hint of a smile. Inside the courtroom, I noticed how the deputies carried themselves, not stiff with fear, but alert with respect. They greeted everyone the same, regardless of how they looked, what they wore, or where they sat. Something had shifted, not just in one courthouse, but in a system that once refused to look inward. And the irony was, it all started with a laugh. A cheap one. One they thought no one would remember. But I remembered. And now, so did the system. Not because I demanded change. Because I became the quiet reminder that power doesn't announce itself. It walks in, unbothered. And leaves something behind that lingers long after the room is empty. Weeks later, I revisited that original courthouse one last time, unannounced, unescorted, and deliberately without a badge. No one stopped me. I walked the familiar hallway, the same one where I'd once been mocked like a stranger in my own house. But now, even the air felt different. Respect wasn't just given when earned, it had been planted, and it had grown. I stepped into the empty courtroom. No cases today. Just silence. I sat down on the same wooden bench where it all began. No cameras. No press. No uniformed authority. Just me. And that same smooth courtroom wood, worn by time, still holding the memory of every story that passed through it. This wasn't just about one man being underestimated. It was about every quiet figure in a room who has to prove themselves twice before they're seen once. And every system that learns, slowly, that the badge doesn't always come first. Sometimes, the title walks in last, and leaves first. As I stood to go, I looked back at the judge's bench, the witness stand, the rows of seats. Nothing moved. But everything had changed.